Hello and welcome back to the Fullerton College Pre-Press class. This is your professor, Ben Hewitt. Today we're taking a look at digital trapping from the PIA's Pre-Press Handbook 6.6. So we're going to talk about what a trap is and talk about the two different versions of trap used in the printing industry because as with most words, good luck finding only one meaning. On the upside is the more meanings you have, the more opportunities for bad puns present themselves. We're going to look at the sources of misregistration and why trapping is necessary, and we're going to talk about some specific terms. I think I told you up front, this class is at least in part a language class so that you may all speak printer. And then we'll also look at the different methods and ways of making these things we call traps. So let's take a look at digital trapping. First off, trap. Trap is a thin, what is it in general? Or specifically here, really. Trap is a thin area where two colors touch. It's a slight overlap where both colors exist to cover the edge between the two. The width of one of these traps has to be greater than the average misregister. So typically that's between 2 and 6 thousandths of an inch. We're talking some very small overlap for offset printing. The more your printing is off, or the more chance you have of registering wrong, which is when the different colored plates don't line up as cleanly as you'd like, the bigger the trap you need to cover it. There's another name for it. Trap is also something people talk about in the press room when they're talking about how well will one ink stick to another. So if you're printing them on top of each other, the ink trapping on there is the ink sticking to the other ink that's still wet so you can print quickly. But that's not the meaning we're really focusing on. We're focusing on that overlap because that's the one that's quite important for making a good looking print. Let's also quickly give ourselves the very horrible analogy that I like to give when I'm talking about trapping. Trapping solves the printing version of a real world wardrobe problem. I don't mean to pick on any one profession, but for some reason, this one works best in my head for it. Imagine a plumber who's come over to your place to fix something under your kitchen sink. He's bent down underneath, working on that pipe. And what do you see? Why, his trousers don't quite come up all the way, do they? There's a nice, thin white line where his tidy whities stick out above that pant line and where below where his shirt is pulled up to, because let's face it, most clothing wasn't meant for people to crouch over and bend down in front of people. That's not how it's meant to be worn or viewed. So there you see that thin, tidy whitey white line. And hopefully nothing more, because that's where I'm going to stop the analogy before it gets horribly gross. But that's what we're also dealing with printing. When you have two things that should line up to each other that for some reason don't, you see a gap. And it's unsightly. To a printer, a little hairline of white paper sticking through in the middle of an image is just as unsightly as that tidy whitey waistband sticking up above somebody's pants while they're bent over working on your sink. Sorry if I scarred anybody. Anyways, trapping is the equivalent of wearing a longer shirt and tucking it in because you create an overlap. When you wear a longer shirt and you tuck it into your trousers, into your pants, that means that you're going to have less chance of a gap showing up. If your clothing just barely meets at the waist, you're not really going to have much wiggle room. And if you look at older clothing, let's talk about some dorky stuff here. If you look at, let's just say, British World War II era military uniforms, they have those short kind of, like we call them Eisenhower, which is funny because he's American, but it's still the British look, these short little jackets on top and these very tall trousers underneath. Also, you might think if you're looking at more contemporary popular results of this, maybe your Kylo Ren pants. There's a famous scene where he takes off his jacket and his pants go up to like his armpits. Well, that's also trapping. The military uniform and also the Kylo Ren costume. When the pants come up that high, that means you can wear a shorter shell jacket and you don't have to worry about a gap. Even if you're bent down, hunkered into a trench, avoiding incoming fire, you still don't have that unsightly gap because your trousers are coming up higher. So either you bring your shirt lower or you bring your pants higher. And in either case, you're covering up the ability of other people to see your underwear when you move and bend over. And for Printing, we overlap the colors we print on press so that you never, if the things don't quite line up perfectly, you never get that horrible white gap. That's what trapping is all about. Now, before we use multicolor presses commonly, before offset litho and um, multicolor presses, everything was overprinted. It was called a dry trap. You would print, and then the ink would dry, and you would print on top of it again. Maybe I'll post a picture of this from a sample I have in my office if I remember to take a picture and send it to myself, because this would be worth looking at. But in historic prints, again, even in you're talking color printing, early lithography, not offset lithography, but straight up on a wet stone lithography, things for fashion claims and early color printing and early reproductions of artwork, you would color on the lithostone, you would print it, and after it's dry, you would color a second color on the lithostone and print directly on top. Everything was overprinted. There was no having to line things up for the trap because it was always on top of the previous one. That's called dry trapping. Also, the inks back then were so opaque, it didn't matter. You didn't really see the color underneath. You weren't using the modern, more translucent inks, which are built to allow the other color below to be seen through it, which if you're doing process color is 100% required for that to work. High opacity inks cover up what's underneath. Think like painting house paint over something else. For the most part, unless you're using specific colors, of course, there's always a hole in an analogy. For the most part, you're painting house paint on top of something, and whatever's underneath just gets covered up in the new colors on top. That's a high opacity pigment. Trapping is necessary because there are lots of ways that the paper, or not the paper, that the press can misregister plate to plate. One of them is the exchange of the sheet from the gripper to gripper, because on large multicolor presses, oftentimes the paper gets gripped and then passed to another gripper for each individual print unit. Why would you do that and not just have a single gripper that goes through the whole thing? Well, I'm glad you asked. Well, if you think about it, multicolor presses exist at 4+ color stations or press units. If you're looking at how you would build a press like that, if you built them all to have a single gripper that goes all the way through and a single chain drive that runs the entire length of the press, that means every single press component has to be built, bespoke, and custom for whatever shop is ordering it at the number of stations you need. However, if you build a press unit that you can tack on as many as you want and just kind of module them together, that's a much easier manufacture because then you just need to be able to build one unit over and over and over again. And depending on who's ordering them, when you build them into their print shops, you just put more or less of them chained onto each other, daisy chained, attached end to end to end. And that is a much easier thing to build. So most presses are built like this, where it's just a sequence of press units, each with their own delivery system built into it. That means the paper going through the press has to be grabbed by each individual press unit and passed to the next one. And while these machines are very well engineered and very well constructed, anytime you move paper from one place to another and change something physically from one holder to another, there will be some slight changes that do exist. So that'll be a thing. Humidity and moisture content. You know, until you really study paper, paper seems to be pretty, what do you call it? Firm, pretty standard, pretty much one thing. I can't think of the word right now, and I'm very sorry. It fell out of my head, the word I was going to use. But paper seems to just exist in a singular sense. Paper is. Except that paper is not just one thing. Paper changes. Paper is not always the same. Paper is subject to humidity, to temperature. Sorry, truck going by. Paper very much exists in the world it's in, and it's made out of wood. It's made out of organic material. When things get damp, paper gets more damp and it gets more limp and supple. When the weather gets dry and staticky out, your paper clings to each other in the stacks, and it doesn't bend as cleanly. In fact, you might notice if you work with paper enough, you find yourself getting a lot more paper cuts on hot, dry days than you do on the cool, damp ones, because the paper itself is more rigid. Sorry about that, another truck. That's what I get for working by an open door on campus today. Anyways, The humidity causes the paper to change size. When it gets damp, it expands, it gets bigger. Not noticeably, you'll never notice it by a naked eye. You might not even notice it on a normal ruler. It's a very subtle difference, but it doesn't take much. With the level of precision that we print at, a very minor, very small change in the size of your paper causes it not to be the same size anymore. So if you print it one day and you print again on another day, that's an issue. Also, the moisture content happens while you print. Some of that water from the ink versus water system built into an offset press makes the paper damp. And when the paper gets damp, it expands, it gets a little bit bigger. Not perceptibly, but enough that your colors no longer line up perfectly like they would have if the paper remained dry the whole way through. Also, it's not just getting wet on the press, it's being smashed down. Think about it. If you're playing with Play-Doh or if you're baking a pizza or something, you roll that dough with a rolling pin to flatten it, or if you're making cookies or something, you're rolling out your cookie dough and the dough gets wider and wider as you press into it with a roller. Well, an offset press has a pressurized roller pushing against the paper and it's getting damp to soften it slightly. The paper actually does get a little bit larger. So these are reasons that you need to do it. This isn't even counting things like sloppy registration. This is just actually assuming your registration is great and all your team members are working at their very best. There's still reason to trap. Let's talk about some terminology. Up at the top here, we have something called overprint. Overprint is when you print one color of ink directly on top of another color of ink and they overlap. Knockout is when you do not print the lower colored ink. Knockout is good for things like spot color when you don't want the inks to mix. Because if you print another color on top of your spot color or below it, your spot color may not look the way it's supposed to in that Pantone book, because that always assumed is being printed on white paper. So knockout removes that undercolor so that the color you're printing on top can be seen in its purest form. Reverse is a card you don't like getting in Uno. Reverse is also where you do a knockout, but with no color. So instead of printing, in this case, kind of a magenta text on white paper, instead you print a magenta background and leave the spot where the words would be blank so that the color of the paper comes through. That is a reverse. Two more to talk about here, choking and spreading. That doesn't really sound great when you say them out loud together. But here's what they are. A choke is when you constrict. Think less about murdering people and think more about chokes on things like lawnmower engines. Adjusting the choke is how much air is being allowed through because you open and close the choke on more simple engines. This also happens by computer and car engines, but you don't know about it because it's just kind of happening as you push down the gas pedal and brakes. It's no longer manually controlled like it was back in the 1910s. But anyways, the choke means you are constricting. That means you contract the background. So instead of having a white space on top for that brown for the word choke, you can see a darker spot around the edges on there where the blue background is being brought into the space the brown ink was going to be printed on. And spread is when the color gets spread out. So instead of printing the yellow word spread here at its normal size, it's printed bigger than it's need to, and the blue behind it gets an overlap because the yellow got bigger. So the choke is when the background gets larger and the white space gets smaller. Spread is where the foreground gets larger and the background stays the same size. Both of those are done to increase the overlap, and it's chosen as to which one you're going to do based off the colors of ink that get used. Stroke is something else that can be done. Stroke is actually something you might have seen in both Illustrator and InDesign, also in Photoshop. Stroke is adding an outline around the edge of a vector shape. Strokes typically are set to overprint. Even if the object inside knocks out, the stroke, it actually creates an overprint. So if you're going to ever manually create trapping for something, like for a screen print or something, you can do it by using a stroke on your artwork in Illustrator or InDesign. I'm going to stop here and come back for another video. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk soon.